So yeah, I'm Bender Prem Kumar, and I'm a school teacher. I work in a secondary school. I'm also the district secretary for Redbridge National Education Union. I'm a branch and district secretary as well. Today, I'm really going to be talking about my experiences as a teacher with the curriculum. So really just going to be focusing on how and why we need to make schools more inclusive, and why there is such a big movement to decolonize the school curriculum and embed a much more anti-racist approach. I think most educators you talk to, and students actually, will tell you that the curriculum is, neither diverse or inclusive. I'm going to take my subject, GCSE English Literature, as an example. I know dead white male is a cliche, but that's literally the writers that dominate the curriculum. So if I go through who we study at GCSE English Literature, which is a 2-year course, we study 2 playwrights, both are dead white males. We study 1 novel, happens to be a dead white male as well. We also study 15 poems, and only 4 of the poets are females, and only 2 are Black. And the majority, so the remaining 8 poets, are dead white males. And so what this means is, over 2 years of literature curriculum, we spend approximately about a week on Black poets, and that's it. That's just one example of a subject. Other teachers will tell you from their own experiences of teaching their subjects how, there is a very, very clear ideological decision by government policymakers to elevate white voices, narratives, and perspectives, and therefore marginalize Black voices. And I suppose we do have to ask why there's such an attempt to whitewash Britain's culture, history, and essentially identity, and marginalize Black voices. I suppose this legacy, this is the legacy of the David Cameron government. So you may recall in 2011, David Cameron declared a war on multiculturalism in a speech he made. And he attacked migrants, and he talked about how they didn't speak English, and he also attacked Muslim community in particular as well. Now, it's the architect of the curriculum that we've got in schools at the moment is Michael Gove, and he was helped by Dominic Cummings to reform the education system, and he introduced reforms that I think most educators would say is narrow, regressive, and insular. So essentially, what Gove did is he removed the school curriculum's explicit focus on racial and ethnic diversity, and this was in order to create a sense of British identity as homogenous. British identity, if you look at the curriculum, you'll probably conclude is white, Christian, traditional, male, and straight. So Michael Gove, helped by Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings is never far from, whenever there's something wrong, you kind of find out that Dominic Cummings is behind this. But Dominic Cummings was the Michael Gove's aide at that time. And they both successfully, you could say, realized David Cameron's dream of this war on multiculturalism by making British identity exclusive. So if you're Black, what they wanted, you to kind of understand is that you don't really belong and your voice doesn't matter. But the problem with this is that our curriculum doesn't reflect the lives of the students because they're living in in a Britain that is multicultural, it's diverse, it's modern, and it's 21st century. So there's a real disconnect between the curriculum that our students are being subjected to and their lives, because our students are global citizens and they are not interested in borders. And yet they're being encouraged to look to the past for inspiration. Another concern about the curriculum that arises is that there is obviously a rise in far-right politics, not just in Britain, but across Europe. And a diverse curriculum is the perfect antidote to that. So hearing experiences, having a kind of a plurality, oh God, I can't say it now, but having, being exposed to many experiences, that it does not necessarily reflect their own experiences, is only beneficial for young children, and it's an enriching education as well. So actually, even if students are living in very monoracial schools and communities, it's good for them to be exposed to a diverse curriculum. Another reason why educators are calling for the decolonising the curriculum is because we want the truth to be taught in schools about Britain's past. So slavery, empire and migration are deliberately left out of the curriculum. And so when we talk about slavery, I'm sure you'll be aware that we only educate our students about how Wilberforce freed slaves, and we don't really talk about Britain's involvement in the kind of horrific legacy of slavery. And however, we do know that the legacy and ongoing impact of the ideas that shaped colonisation and the actions of the British Empire contributes to contemporary racial inequalities. So, I don't need to remind you about Grenfell and the stop and search and the racial profiling of Black males, the George Floyd incident, and even now, the way that it is the disadvantaged students who are affected by the exams mess created by Gavin Williamson. It's not, again, obviously it is a deliberate attack on disadvantaged students, and I'm sure it is the minority groups that were mostly affected as well. The other thing about slavery, migration and colonisation is that these historical events are intrinsic to Black students' identities. And by ignoring all of it in schools, we're not helping them make sense of the world that they are living in. But that's not the only problem with schools. The curriculum isn't the only issue. There are whole school practices that stereotype and discriminate Black students too. So, it will not be news to you that young Black boys and girls' behaviour are frequently interpreted as intimidating and aggressive, and therefore they're subject to more behaviour sanctions compared to their white counterparts. And exclusions data supports this. So if we have a look at the students who are frequently excluded from schools, Gypsy and Roma and Traveller of Irish heritage pupil have the highest exclusion rates. That's a minority group that's being targeted there. But also mixed Black and Black Caribbean students also have the highest exclusion rates, and both were nearly 3 times as likely to be excluded as white pupils. Interestingly, it is pupils from Chinese and Indian ethnic groups who had the lowest exclusion rate. So what can you infer from that? I think the statistics reveal that schools are institutionally racist. They discriminate students based on popular racist stereotypes. So Black people are threatening and intimidating and aggressive, whereas Asians are studious, passive, and obedient. Both stereotypes are obviously damaging, but I accept one is much more damaging than the other. Uniform codes are also used to target Black students. Afros, braids, hairstyles favoured by Black students are condemned as not smart or having links with gang membership, whereas someone who looks like Boris Johnson with hair, really, really messy, covering their face, is never kind of condemned as not looking smart. That's usually interpreted as being a bit idiosyncratic or having a bit of a personality. Other kind of ways students are discriminated or stereotyped is I myself have had to listen to my own colleagues working in my school as Asian girls being stereotyped as lacking in cultural capital, unable to hold intellectual stimulating discussions and debates. And the problem with that kind of stereotyping is that when teachers don't believe in students, students don't believe in themselves, and they internalize ideas like that. And that really does impact on their confidence and their ability to achieve as well. And this is also backed by data that shows that teacher predictions and teachers frequently underpredict Black students. So Black students actually do much better in exams than the grades that they were predicted by their teachers. Asian students are also targeted by something called the PREVENT strategy, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and it stigmatizes Muslim students. And as teachers, we're kind of asked to spot potential terrorists, which is absolutely outrageous. So I suppose, really, the truth is that Black students are disadvantaged in schools, and racism begins in schools. It's there in the curriculum, but it's not just the curriculum. Those kind of ideas are present in the entire system. So really, that needs changing. And I suppose the felling of statues, historical statues, is really very, very inspiring. But it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of campaigning, I think, to kind of root out this kind of curriculum and biases, because it's really written into the school system, and it's been there for such a long time as well. But it is possible, I think, to change as well. My union, the National Education Union, has produced something called the Anti-Racism Framework, and that's a really brilliant tool. It basically gets you to kind of audit your school, not just the teaching and learning that's happening in your school, but whole school practices. And I think all schools should be encouraged to look at that document and to adopt it and use it faithfully, because I think it can make a real impact on the experiences of all educators, but Black students in particular as well. And I think it will definitely benefit the community. But it really is something that needs the community on board. It's not something that's going to be achieved by educators alone. I think the protest that somebody referred to at the start of the meeting, the student protest, they're absolutely brilliant. I mean, teachers have been complaining about the education system and the exam system for such a long time, but we hardly get listened to. But I think this is the time really now to bring students and community members and unions working together to decolonize the school curriculum, as there is a move to decolonize popular history, I think, with what's happening in with the statues, but also in other areas as well. And I'll finish there.
Brilliant, thanks. I think that leaves, that's a good start for debate and discussion, but leaves plenty of room for discussion there. I'm sure most people, again, are used to using Zoom and things now. I think we sort of try and make the best of what different levels of people are, but if you can use the function of raising your hand, if you haven't got it, I'll remind people again, if you go to where it says participants, the two sort of figures at the bottom there, a screen comes up, and one of it there, whoops, sorry, is typical, isn't it? Is raise your hand. So please, if people raise their hand and make a comment, it's not so easy to see everybody, but if you wave, I'll try and do my best to see everybody as well. Okay, is there anybody who wants to start us off? Tamsin, I can see you. If you'd like to start us off.
Yeah, I remember when I worked at the Caledon Centre, see, my mum's born in India. She's mixed origin, but she's born in India. And I don't speak any Hindi or Bengali. She does. She speaks both. But I never really knew a lot about Indian history or literature or anything. And I remember a nurse at the Caledon Centre telling me about Rabindranath Tagore. And I've got one of his books here. It's short stories. He wrote quite a lot of short stories. And they're good stories. I bought that in Oxfam. And they're all about ordinary people and some of the terrible things that happen to them and their struggles. I mean, it's quite individual struggles. It's not, the ones I've read so far anyway, they're not collective struggles, but they're still about the difficulties that people experience. And I found that a really interesting and lovely book. I mean, he wrote some brilliant poems, and there's quite a famous one. I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a part of it in the back of the book, and it's just really lovely to read. So I'd recommend him as a writer. But, you know, you'd never see something like that covered in the literature curriculum at school. And years ago as well, I read, it was after Gabriel Garcia Marquez died that I read 100 Years of Solitude. And again, that one's just really good. I mean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, I think, was to the left. He was a Marxist. And there's a bit where he writes about, during the book, it's magical realism, the style of his writing. So there's a bit where he writes about strike by fruit workers and how they were all shot, and how the ruling class broke their strike. And again, you know, I think it's not just about ethnicity, but about class as well. I mean, there's so many books about class as well that you just would not see in the mainstream curriculum. There's so much that we're deprived of, really, by not studying a broader range of literature. Or after there was that other guy, the Nigerian fellow whose name I can't remember because I'm struggling with my memory at the minute, the famous one, I can't remember his name. He wrote Things Fall Apart.
Achebe.
Yeah,
Chinua
Achebe, yeah. After he died, again, that like tells you about, you know, it does deal a bit with colonialism towards the end and how that destroyed the social fabric in Nigeria. And, you know, again, it's just not something that would be addressed or dealt with. But one of the other ways that, I mean, one of the things is by becoming politically active, I began to learn a lot more about these kind of issues. And by reading, you know, historical books, but by reading literature and things like that. But also, one of the things at work that I often notice is that there was a colleague a few weeks ago, and we were caring for an elderly guy from Pakistan. And my colleague, white English colleague, had made an effort to learn a few words of Urdu from the catering assistants on the same ward, so that she could better communicate with the patients. And I've often heard people say this, and I often think it myself, the languages that we learn at school, I did A-level Spanish because my dad wanted me to do it. And, you know, I did it, you know, and I kind of liked it. It did me good to learn another language, you know. But however, I often think it would have been much more useful to learn an Indian language, apart from my origins and my mum's origins and all this. It would have been much more useful in my day-to-day life. And I suspect that would be, you know, many people would think that the case, you know, if you're working in care, it'd be much more useful if you could speak a bit of Urdu than a bit of French. And, you know, that's another of those things, you know, what you maybe, again, if we ran society, you might have a bit more choice about what language you learned if you were going to learn a second language. You know, and perhaps you would look at the community around you and learn a language that's relevant to your communication with the people around you. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tamsin. Surprisingly, no one else has indicated. I've got no hands raised. I can't see many people waving at me.
I hope I haven't put people to sleep.
No, just
no. I'm very surprised. Remember, you don't have to make such interesting contributions as Tamsin's, or with such wide breadth of knowledge. You know, as a short, sharp, simple.
I'm just going to dive in again very quickly. I forgot to say, can we add about the Sudanese young man to the agenda?
Yeah, we can.
My apologies.
I'm more than happy for people to raise that in the debate and discussion, or if not, we will talk about it as part of the second half and talk about, you know, what people see. So, right, okay. Francine is at the top of my list. I didn't see who came first, but Francine, do you want to go first, if that's okay? Need to unmute yourself, Francine. That's it.
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm out of practice with Zoom meetings, thank goodness. Yeah, thank you, Venda. That was really interesting. And I have just a short question. When you were speaking, and it's kind of in the title of this, I guess, talking about how slavery and empire could be taught in schools, I wonder how this would look, and asking you as a teacher how you would like that to be taught and who you would like to be teaching that.
Excellent question. Yeah, thank you. And I've got, it says Ben, but I know it's not Ben. Mark, I think it is, isn't it? Mark, do you want to go next?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I just want to know how important the nation state is when it comes to the history of the nation state, when it comes to education. Because obviously the ruling class have a serious monopoly on history in the nation state. They want their history to be taught in school, not our history to be taught in schools. And I know that there's an argument in history that England only had half a revolution. They cut the king's head off, then they introduced the monarchy back, and the ruling class attached themselves to that. You know, the Queen, we're supposed to, like, we're her subjects, that's taught in school. I just want to know how the French, do the French have a similar sort of education system to us? Because they went a bit further. They got rid of the king. They got rid of all the landed gentry. And obviously Russia went further than that in 1917. But my point is, like, when education and history and diversity, you know, France did have an empire, and Britain, not as big, but it had an empire. It has diversity. It has African citizens, Asian citizens, Indo-China citizens. And is the French system slightly different? If you could elaborate on that a bit. How far have they gone forward because they got rid of all their landed gentry and their whatever, you know what I mean? That's really my question. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Okay, have we got anybody else?
Tony.
Yeah.
Speak,
Yeah.
but can't raise their hand.
Yeah. Peace wants to speak.
Yeah, okay, Peace. Please. You'll need to unmute yourself, please.
Okay.
Yep, that's it, please. Thanks.
Hi, I figured it out. Yeah, so but I want to contribute to what Francine said about how to actually, even if these other cultures or histories are being taught. My question is, do you think that might also further intensify racism on the way it's being taught, and if it's also being taught in a classist kind of way? And also it might actually also give more information about maybe some vulnerabilities of these cultures, which might actually deepen racism. That's my first question. And the second for me is more of a contribution towards presently being a postgraduate student in the UK, on how the education system is still colonized, where you have lots of international students and most of the curriculum is still British and still Eurocentric. And with the huge amounts of money international students come to pay for this education, I don't think it also equips them enough to thrive in their own environment and within their own cultures or within the structures of their own economies. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Peace. That's really helpful. Okay, we got anybody else? Yep, right. I can see. I'll start from the bottom of my list if that's okay. It doesn't, stupid software, of course, they're going to have to improve because it doesn't tell you what order people put in, and I'm having trouble looking at 3 pages at once. But Lorraine, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I wanted to ask as well, like, so what is the solution to young people who have been excluded from school based on this unfair system that we are in? What should they do?
Yeah, I think that's an important question for us as educators, certainly. Patricia, do you want to make your contribution or question, please?
Thank you, and thank you very much, Vendor, for that talk. It was great. Thank you. Yeah, I was just musing as you were describing you referred repeatedly in the early part of your talk about dead white males. White males are thinking of patriarchy, and this is where the power is still held on boards in banks or in large multicultural corporations. I mean, I personally think it's no accident that the literature talk backs up the balance of power. As we've identified, the power for change will come from the staff and students and the pressure for change on the streets. I think we have to be ruthless in forcing change, as ruthless as they have been in only presenting one particular section of history and of literature and of art in that sense. Thank you.
There you go. I'm even forget to put my microphone on. Sorry, Dave Kersey, you're next, please.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to say that in answer to Peter's contribution, I think racism exists in every country because capitalism breeds racism. You can't have one without the other, as we've discussed at previous meetings. But I think the nature of racism in the UK, among white people in the UK who consider themselves indigenous British, is shaped very much by the education we received at school, because, as was pointed out in the talk, the whole of our education is focused on the history of the UK as being the centre of the British Empire, and connected to that, the notion that Britain is the most civilised country in the world. That's what we were all taught from a very early age, along with allegiance to the monarchy. The notion that the British Empire was a civilising influence on every country within the British Empire by the British. Obviously, you can't go through that kind of education without it leaving an impression in your minds that somehow you're separate from the rest of the world and not in a healthy way. and therefore, when racism gets expressed in, if you look at recent examples of how refugees have been treated, just, you know, some of the comments I've seen even today on social media about the death of the Sudanese refugee in the Channel, and the notion is that people are coming from outside into a privileged country, and that somehow we need to be protected from that outside world. And at the back of that notion, if you think it through, is the notion that Britain is the centre of the world and a superior country, and that is something taught from an early age. Now, I don't think you can disconnect those two ideas going on in people's heads. Now, obviously, having said all that, there's a great deal of opportunity for white British people like myself to learn otherwise. Yeah, we are given, so the Labour movement has a fantastically important role. The influence of campaigners, of campaigns like Black Lives Matter make a real positive difference to the kind of ideas in people's heads who are white people as well. So it's not, you know, we should never be treated as any form of excuse. It's an explanation that that the nature of racism and the deep ingrained really in people's learning is that notion of the British Empire, and that remains the case today. You know, and it's very mixed up because it's also the people in the last couple of generations connected with the teaching we get about the Second World War and Britain's role and Britain's great victory over Germany. And it's kind of, I just think you can't understand racism in this country without the outcome of that. And, you know, people like, when we talk about statues of Winston Churchill, his notion of India and his attitude to people within what was then the decaying remains of the British Empire was very much shaped by that kind of defence by the ruling class of something they saw slipping away. And that, I think, there's a reflection of that in a lot of people's heads. So anyway, I think when we argue with people about racism, I think we have to take on that notion that our education was neutral, and we have to say, actually, we were taught this from an early age for a very specific reason, and we have to counter it in our own heads in order to counter it in other people's.
Thanks, Dave. One thing, I've got a couple of more people wanting to speak now. I just thought while you were speaking there, Dave, and looking at the chat, there's quite a big reading list starting to appear on the chat, which is great, but not everybody has access to all of these books. I'm sure if there are comrades and colleagues in the meeting who would like to borrow some of these, let some of us know, and we can share books. Quite a few of us have got pretty heaving bookshelves, but also we have a bookstall for the branch and books for sale within the branch on a lot of the topics we're talking about. So if people want to talk to us about that, feel free. So what I've got next is Ian, and then once Ian's said what he wants to say, I've got Saskia, yeah? So Ian first.
He's probably nipped off to the loo or something.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. It's not Ian, it's Cathy McCoy. Hello, Patricia. Just to say, in case you remember me, I'm the French teacher. I wanted to say thank you.
Hi, Cathy. Yeah, great
Sorry
to hear
about
you.
the confusion, but I'm on the phone. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you to Venda. That was really interesting because it's another perspective from a French side of things. From the teacher side of things, somebody a couple of minutes ago asked a question about how it happened, what things happening in France, and about did the French Revolution make any difference? I can't remember who asked that question. So anybody? No? I thought maybe somebody
I think it was
might.
Mark, wasn't it?
Was
I think
it?
it was
I can't
Mark.
remember. I don't know.
Ben,
Was it Benjamin? Okay.
Benjamin?
So just so happens I'm here, so I thought I was not going to take part because I'm not that confident in speaking. But anyway, I can reassure you that it's nothing to do with the revolution or anything like that. There's been a revolution in France, and it has not made any difference, I would say. I went to school in the 70s and the 80s, and I'm still teaching French now. And I have relatives with children who go to school and so on. And I can honestly say that France is, how can I say, it's still regarded as what we call the métropole, which is just the French territory. So as far as education goes, it's very much centered to that. Only recently were the dom-toms added to that map for, say, some weather forecasts and so on. So dom-toms are the French departments and territories that are out in the sea somewhere, in different oceans and so on. So, and regards education in school and so on, I can only give one little example. I'm in my 50s now, and I read quite a lot, and I read the classics and so on. And I feel almost embarrassed to say that I only just found out that Alexandre Dumas, who wrote The Three Musketeers, was actually of mixed race. And I had no idea. And I read the book, I saw the films, and I have various literature books about that era and everything. And I actually found a photo or a portrait, and I never realized that this person had a black parent. So I think that's quite telling, really. And when I questioned a few people in my family, nobody had an idea. Well, I mean, most of you will have heard of The Three Musketeers, I'm sure. But yeah, I mean, it's such a classic in France, and people had really no idea because it's just not spoken of, really, I would say. I mean, in every, I can remember whether it was in primary school or in secondary school, when that book would be on the shelf, it was never discussed. So I'm a little bit surprised by all that. And yeah, so I talked about the map thing. France has a lot of territories. That was sort of the fruit of colonialism. And I think most of the time on the political agenda, they're more of a hindrance than anything else for France, it seems. And now and then a minister or president has to show that these islands are still existing and are being sent over, and we sort of to prove that they're still part of the country. And a lot of people in main France probably wonder, you know, where is this place, and they have to check on the map. So there's a lot of ignorance on that side as well. I think that's all I wanted to say, except one little thing. I discovered all this by through Facebook, the meeting and so on. I don't know if anybody has checked out the Facebook page of something called Colonial Countryside, which is a Facebook page that one of my daughters has contributed to. And it is actually an initiative by a person who is trying to educate children and adults via visits of stately homes and see the impact of colonialism and the empire and so on this building, on the art and so on. And I know that my daughter, who wrote parts of the blog, you know, sort of shared a lot of information on it. I thought it was really, really quite interesting. If anybody wanted to have a nose at that, I feel like I'm advertising for them, but I really think there is a little bit of a link there, because a lot of schools and students are being brought to these stately homes now and get to this guided visit, but with the other side of things. Not just the typical history stories, but to show how, yes, that's the one. I can see Tamsin showing the the page. So, okay, that's all for me. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kate.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that was really good. So we've got Saskia next, and then we've got Sean and Clive. So Saskia.
Hi, sorry. I don't know if this is the right place to do this, but basically I've been in touch with my school, who are an independent school in the area, because there were a number of racist incidents I witnessed at the school. They didn't take it seriously, so then I spoke to kids across a number of different age groups since the 5 years I've left, including current pupils who commented similar things, such as blackface, people saying the N-word, people pretending they were KKK members, which is just a whole thing. I've spoken to the headmaster at my school, had a long discussion with him a couple of months ago, and he effectively was like, it's a lot of food for thought, and kind of left it there. I'm trying to find a way to sort of encourage them to do something or find something to do with them. So if anyone has any advice or any organisations or anything, I'd just be really appreciative. So yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. I'm sure there are loads of people really keen to help you with that, Saskia. I mean, I think one of the things, apart from, you know, various things, as I'm sure you've figured out, there's quite a few of us in the meeting who are teachers, ex-teachers and whatever, and I think contacting the union, the National Education Union, would be important. It's a key thing for the union, and although, you know, there may or may not be union members in the school, it might be a starting point, and the local union would help you with that. Okay, Sean, if you want to have a go.
Hi, thanks. You hear me all right? First of all, I just want to say hello to Kathy, by the way. I was in her French class, so 2 or 3 times. I just recognised her voice and I was, oh, is that Kathy Mackay? Hi, Kathy. I just want to say something about what Dave Kersey said. I kind of basically agree with him, I guess, but I think we should also qualify when we talk about racism being ingrained, about where it comes from and what have you, because, you know, racism, I think, has always been contested, you know. And it annoys me now sometimes when people talk about the 1970s as if they were the 1950s, you know. We were actually fighting racism. Lots of us who were fighting racism in the 70s, it wasn't a completely homogeneous thing, you know what I mean? And actually throughout history, I mean, even if you look at the American Civil War, for example, support for slavery was big amongst Lancashire and northwest England, amongst workers who actually faced real problems because of the Civil War, you know, impacting on the cotton industry. But they still stood out and supported, you know, organised workers in the Northwest supported the fight against slavery. And, you know, there's many cases throughout this of history that even today, if you look at things like Stand Up to Racism, for example, a lot of the financial support it gets is from the trade union movement. You know, we really need organised working class ability to collectively organise against racism. And also it's always, I think, the foundation really that we rely on is organised working class people to actually provide the kind of resources that we need to really challenge racism, you know, effectively. And I'm not saying we shouldn't work with anybody against racism, as Stand Up to Racism does, but we also should recognise that when, you know, when the heat is on, where you can actually get that support is from rank and file workers, even if the trade union leaders sometimes just compromise with it, you know, with racism. From below, we can fight back against that. And it's not just that racism is ingrained, though. It's that it's part of the class conflict that we live in, you know. And the bosses work really, really hard, don't they, constantly to reinforce racism, you know. it's happening today when we talk about the migrants crossing the channel or refugees crossing the channel. You know, here the Tory speakers, the same old thing, Labour speakers not being as strong as we know they should be against it, etc., because they have to, you know, they need the divisions caused by racism to maintain the status quo, you know. And that's why there's a fight on all the time for them to remind us all the time about racism and try and ingrain it into us. But there's also challenges from below. And I think the challenge is always higher when working class people are united in fighting back. And that's been the same throughout history, you know. That's why the class struggle is really, really important when we come to fighting against racism as well. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Sean. Clive, if you want to go next, please.
Yes, okay, yeah. I don't know what school Saskia goes to, but myself and Tony Conway from Comrades Against Racism met with the City of Culture people this morning, and we requested that they fund a package to go into schools, which would have a kick-off meeting with cultural events during obviously it doesn't start till next May, but we can get it ready to get in before that if necessary. A cultural event to kick it off, and then having sections on each of the communities within Coventry and their contributions to Coventry culture. And we were looking to get people. I've already got some students who are willing to introduce that at assemblies in Foxford and at Caledon Castle, etc. So if we can get in touch with us, we can certainly get your school involved in that process as well, because the City of Culture are interested in funding that. Secondly, France, the only thing I remember about, not the only thing, but one of the main things I remember about France and slavery is that Toussaint Louverture, when the famous first slave rebellion in Haiti, when the first place he went to get recognition was after the 1789 French Revolution, and of course got recognized by the revolutionaries. It is, yeah, and then when Venda talks about A-level English, I did A-level English, and I can remember I did Milton and Chaucer and Shakespeare and all those. We did do Jane Austen and Virginia Woolf as well, but you know, the bias was absolutely clearly to dead white males. And this is no accident when Dave says, you know, we are brought up with this education. Fortunately, I was also brought up to believe that the Union Jack, or the Union flag, as it should be called, is the butcher's apron by my father, who was a socialist. So there's an alternative tradition of history from socialists, and you know, he would tell us about what happened at Amritsar and how the British went around and wielded their power around the world, and that's not you know, that's not an accident, because he was a collier, a coal miner in South Wales valleys, and they were getting oppressed as well. And they took in Spanish Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. They were genuine internationalists. So there is another tradition, but you know, race. The original meaning of race was kinship. It was not something that determined your biological features. It meant an area that you came from, whatever your color or physical qualities, and it meant kinship, and it meant which family you were born into. Now, it's only under the development of capitalism that changed dramatically, and it's no accident that Black history is not reported in schools, because they became non-people. Quite simply, when you know the Spaniards went to South America, discovered gold and silver, and started pillaging for that. When the British landed in Virginia, there was no gold and silver, and they decided that they were going to plant tobacco, and then went further in and and did cotton. Now, that meant they wanted intensive labour, and that meant that they used the slave trade to justify the slave trade of getting labour from Africa. They needed to not recognise black people from the slave countries as people, not as, they weren't human beings. They were property. They were the property. And if you were born to a slave, you were still property. You know, you were not a free human being. Therefore, you could not have a history. There was no history worth, in fact, it wasn't just black and Asian people that came to that. Whiteness was purely Anglo-Saxon originally. It didn't even include Celts or Jews or anything. It was later on that Celts and Jews were included, and it became white versus everybody else. And that was the only history that was developed. It was, you know, now we have to reclaim the real history of the world, the huge tradition of, you know, the South American Incas, of the Persians, of the Egyptians, of the Chinese. You know, this history was totally ignored and or never taught in British or in Western European schools. Clearly it's there. Not only is it there, but, you know, the Americans are quite willing to bomb it out of existence when they bomb Iraq and Iran at various occasions. And you know, that's what even the Taliban and Al Qaeda threatened to do, to destroy parts of history and culture. Now, we quite clearly are on the other side of the coin, just like my father was arguing many years ago that there's an alternative tradition. We have to keep that alternative history going. And I think it is lacking. And it's not just about what songs you sing and what, you know, costumes you wear from each nationality. There is a strong tradition of intermingling through the spice trade and trading, and we're all from different cultures. I think and becoming multicultural at the end of it is the key thing, not celebrating the differences. And you know, it's great to see the Biden's nominee for vice president. They don't know how to describe her, because she's part Asian, she's part Eastern European, she's part black. What the hell is she? She's, you know, historically she would have been called a non-human being, let alone a non-person. So I think we have to review our whole position on race, re-educate, reclaim history, and you know, yeah, change the world. Thanks.
Thanks, Clive. Right, after a slow start, I think we had quite a few there. We've got one more speaker, one more person.
Can I speak up? I can't raise my hand, and I've said.
Oh right, sorry, Andy. So we've got. So if you go next, Andy, then, because I wasn't sure what you said earlier, and then perhaps Dave Allen can finish us off, and then we'll go back to the speaker. Okay.
Okay, thanks. That was such a great introduction and such a great discussion. Thanks, Venda, for that. I was interested to know what really goes on in school, but I just think after 40 years of anti-racism that I've grown up with in my adult life, we're still at pretty much the same stage we were 50 years ago, 40 odd years ago when I was at school. Not much progress, really. Every time the Black Lives Matter movement in Coventry or anywhere else, almost certainly, has organised an event, on the Facebook page of the local paper, in our case, the Coventry Telegraph, there's a stream of foul reaction, far outweighing all those who support the movement, even though, you know, in the public sense, there's a huge number of people who do support, but there's clearly an awful lot of people who are ignorant, frightened, scared, whatever. And education is the key to that. We weren't taught about our country's history. We weren't taught about slavery and colonialism when we were at school, and it doesn't sound like students are very much today in any great sense. Maybe in a very small sense there's a topic, but I spoke to somebody yesterday who's a teacher, and he says, you know, everything is driven by the curriculum, especially the last 2 years. Everything is driven by the curriculum and what you're going to be examined on. And if the curriculum won't change, which the Tories have said they won't change it, then we're struggling, aren't we? So I'm particularly in history and literature. this struggle must go up a level. It has to be fought for in schools, and even if that means guerrilla action by teachers forcing it onto the agenda, I think that's good. Afua Hirsch, the journalist, she said she went through the British education system, and her experience was almost identical to mine. You go the Romans, the Normans, a few kings and queens, the Tudors, and then you jump, and then it's the First World War. Or what happened between the Tudors and the First World War? Well, maybe have a bit about the Victorians and you know, the guy who invented Jethro Tull and the seed drill or something. But mostly the 17th century, the English Civil War, the English Revolution, we chopped the head off. The 18th century, the rise of empire, colonialism and slavery, they're not talked about. Completely jumped over. We are not taught about these things at school. And it's frighteningly ignorant. A young guy I know joined the army a few years ago, 5 years ago, and he did his basic training and he went away, and then he came back, and I said, oh, hiya. I said, what have you been doing? He said, oh, it's great, you know, we've done the training and we've been to Africa. I said, oh, Africa, brilliant. I said, what country? He said, I don't know. The British Army takes you to another country to possibly kill people or educate or work with the local security services, and you don't even know which country you're in. That's how detailed our knowledge is of the rest of the world in this country, really. It's absolutely outrageous. The system, I mean, we haven't talked about that in this discussion, but education is what's called, as Marxists, we'd say it's part of the superstructure. The economic base is the fact that the bosses own the system, they own the factories, the means of distribution and production and so forth. The superstructure is the ideological superstructure that keeps things together for the ruling class, and education is very much a part of that. So also the fact that there are not black or Asian authors on the curriculum, and we're not taught virtually anything about empire, slavery or the history of African culture and nations. It also applies to the working class as well. I mean, very occasionally you might get an Alan Sillitoe or Irving Welsh possibly on the curriculum, but I think mostly working class writers are excluded as well. We're not expected to recognise ourselves as working class people just as much as multicultural citizens, black citizens of this country are not expected to recognise themselves either. Yeah, I'll leave it there. That's great. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. Right, I think the final person we've got then, if Dave, Alan, if you finish us off, and once Dave's finished speaking, Bender, if you come back and see if you can pull that together for us, that would be fantastic. Thanks. Dave.
Hi, yes. Talking to Saskia, really. I've been amazed this last few years with going to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations here in Rugby, over in Leamington and Stratford and Coventry. And at every single one, young black women have stood up and just talked about the level of racism in their schools. Well, I simply found it, well, it's not unbelievable, it's quite clearly believable, but it's just so sad that it's still going on. I mean, my kids went to school in London about 7 or 8 years ago, finished school, and I'm sure it was a different experience there, but I also feel that if I'd scratched the surface, I'd have found the same things going on there. So but in particular, the last BLM demonstration in Coventry, there was a group of young women from one particular school saying, just talking about the level of racial epithets being thrown around, racial bullying, the refusal or the failure of the teaching staff and the headmaster or headmistresses to do anything about it. Certainly, I think we should be able to put you into contact with people like that, so that you're not operating alone. You're operating with other people. But it really does beg a belief that 40 odd years after things like Black History Month and so forth came out, we're still dealing with this. You know, it's still going on at this kind of level. It's quite heartbreaking, really.
Thanks, Dave. Tamsin, I see you've put your hand up. Do you want to throw something in
Just very
quickly?
quickly, because someone mentioned Afua Hirsch. She was on, I think it was last night actually, there was a series of, it was a series about Africa. And the one I saw, I've got the others recorded, but the one I saw was about Ethiopia. And it was just, again, really educational and interesting. And I kept, you know, you have Shazam on your phone. I kept Shazamming all the music as well. But yeah, it will probably come back on. I think it might have been on BBC4. I'm not sure. But I'm sure they'll probably repeat it again, or it might be on tonight again. But it's worth looking out for things like that because they're really educational and fascinating.
Thanks, Tamsin. Right, Venda, would you like to finish this bit off, please?
Yeah. How long have I got, Tony?
Well, I mean, you know, we've been going quite a long time. I think, you know, 5 minutes or so is nothing really. I think I've not seen anybody fall off the end of the page or anything yet. So, you know,
okay,
whatever you need, really.
All right, thank you. Thank you. That was excellent contributions. So interesting from everybody. I think some questions have been answered, especially the French education system. That is not something I would have been able to comment on. So I'm glad Kathy was able to do that. I'm so pleased Tamsin started off talking about Rabindranath Tagore. He's actually one of my favorite poets, and he won the Nobel Prize for literature. But he's, you know, you would not have come across him. I stumbled upon him after my education through, you know, just a recommendation from a friend, from my own reading, you know, and this is how we come across Black writers and Black history. You know, this is what happens, isn't it? We have to leave education, and then that kind of process of unlearning and re-educating starts. And that, you know, that's basically kind of a reflection of all the things that are wrong with the education system, isn't it? But you hear lots and lots of Black people, Black students say exactly the same thing. If they want to learn about Black contribution, Black heroes, achievements, they have to leave mainstream education to be able to do that. But it's not just, I think, you know, Tamsin's absolutely right. This is not just about targeting Black people. This is about classes, isn't it? This is the whole point of education system, as was mentioned by a few people, is to ensure the status quo stays. And schools only perpetuate the inequality that is in wider society. So it's no surprise that white middle-class students come out of the education system doing very well for themselves. And that was very obvious when we saw the exams results, the A-level exam results. But this is something teachers have known all, you know, for a very long time. But it's also no surprise that actually the education system, you know, is set up for failure for Black students, for minority students, for working class students, for SEN students as well. So it's only there to really reflect and perpetuate the inequalities. And that's the way the bosses like it. That's the way the bosses want it. And that's what education is there for. They need a proportion of the of students, of pupils in schools to see themselves as failure, not to achieve, because they need factory fodder. That's, you know, that's what they're there to serve. So education system is actually, you know, set up to deliberately fail. And it was, again, you know, it was very, very clearly, that was very clearly shown up in this kind of exams chaos, where the exams students had to be downgraded. There was a, you know, that is written into the system, that inequality is written into the system. They won't do that to, obviously, the privileged, to the students from elite backgrounds. That will never happen. So it is our working class students from working class communities who are subject to that. So, you know, that's obviously no surprise to anybody, that it's there. That's the whole purpose of education. I think Francine asked about who should be teaching history. Thought that was a really good question. And I suppose the kind of analogy I make is who's responsible for ensuring our students are not sexist? You know, I would say every person that pupils come into contact with in school, that's their responsibility. And I would say equally, I know it's a very sensitive topic, slavery, but I think this kind of inclusive attitude needs to be the responsibility of every educator and every adult working in a school. And that's the only way we're going to create an anti-racist environment in schools. So where you've got a deeply ingrained racist curriculum that promotes white supremacy and whole school practices that work with that as well, you know, everyone needs to be responsible and everyone needs to kind of adhere to that kind of ethos, really. Otherwise, we are just going to continue to have the same responsibility. But, you know, that is not to say there's obviously a lot of educating that needs to happen. Teachers need training. Believe me, I have spent a large part of COVID-19 educating myself. I realize, you know, I'm a product of this education system. I need to, you know, decolonize my own mind, and I need to, you know, learn things. I don't think I'm not racist because I'm Black myself. I don't think, you know, I'm not capable of, you know, perpetuating that racism or being complicit in it. In fact, I recognize I'm very complicit in a racist education system and a racist society as well. So, you know, and I think, so, you know, I do appreciate there's a lot of learning that needs to happen, but, you know, we can't wait too long. And I think it's everyone's responsibility as well. Somebody asked, Peace, I think asked about, can it embed more racism if we start talking about slavery and migration? I think it's important to recognize that the education system is normalizing white supremacy, because, you know, when you're in school, what you pick up is the cultural norms, you know, what's normal. And the cultural norm that we come away thinking from school is white, middle class, male and straight. Those are the kind of cultural norms that we're kind of being brainwashed and brainwashing our young children into. And therefore, you know, it's no surprise that it's white middle class students who tend to do well for themselves out of the education system. And I agree, the education system, when we reform it, when we change it to reflect our priorities and, you know, it's responsive to what we need it to be. Like Tamsin said, she would have preferred to have learned an Indian language rather than, you know, a European language. However, and so it's you know, and those kind of changes would be absolutely amazing because it's responsive to what the learner wants. But until we get there, I think we need to be pushing critical thinking. And I think most educators realize that no matter how perfect the education system is or imperfect, if we push, what we do have the opportunity to do is teach critical thinking. So whatever is put in front of the students, they are critical of it. They ask questions and they deconstruct it. They don't take it, you know, they don't take it at face value. And I think that's the most important skill we can teach our students. And that should, you know, and I think that most educators would say that's a really important starting point. And I think Lorraine asked about exclusions and what should people do. I certainly think there's no better time to hold schools accountable for their exclusions rate, local authorities accountable for their exclusions rate. And this is where joining forces with Black Lives Matter and Stand Up to Racism, these are the kind of demands we can make. We should be creating task forces with communities, with trade unions, with other, groups that asks these questions of our schools and our local authorities. Show us your exclusions data and be accountable for it. And I think we can make those demands now, because this is the time of Black Lives Matter. What better opportunity is there? And I think the data will be disturbing. But I think what's even more, disturbing is if we leave that, if we miss the opportunity now to do something about it. I really like what David said about a curriculum that is Eurocentric and white-centric, how it helps dehumanize minority groups and migrants and refugees. Again, that's what it's there for, isn't it? And that's why it's so disturbing that we are actually, enablers of all of this, and our education system and the educators in it are complicit in promoting white supremacy in our schools. And absolutely, educators need to be educating themselves and realizing and recognizing the problems within it. But I will say there is a huge move now. There's a real mood amongst educators. Even if we can't change the curriculum, we're finding ways to work around the curriculum. So, yes, we've got lots of dead white males that are, part of the curriculum, but there will be opportunities for us then to kind of introduce other writers that are not compulsory, but we do it because we think it provides more balance. So, and educators are doing that, and there's a real mood for that kind of change. And I think it's really great that Saskia is asking questions, what can we do? How can we, change things? Well, I just think this is we've got the window of opportunity now to push through so many changes. And I think we've got lots of allies with our trade unions and Black Lives Matter groups, lots and lots of interested mothers in Black Lives Matter who've got children in schools. And I think we should be making those links, and we should be pushing for change because, I think it's possible. I think it's incredible what the students were able to do with the student protest. And, who would have thought Edward Colston's statue after 100 years, could be felled? I mean, that's just incredible. And I do think change can happen. I think it's happening on a small scale inside of schools, and I think it's brilliant. We've got public support for that as well. But yeah, we've got to work with the mood, and I think we can change things as well.